At the peak of her career, just days after winning her first Academy Award, Sandra Bullock's entire personal life collapsed in public. The man she'd built a family with, the man she stood beside on stage thanking for finally making her feel loved, was hiding a secret that would detonate everything. Now, decades later, at 61, the full picture of why that marriage could never survive has become impossible to ignore. It's a story about timing, trust, and the kind of betrayal that doesn't just end a relationship. It rewrites how you see your entire life. To understand why this marriage fell apart the way it did, you have to go back to how it started, because the beginning tells you almost everything about what made the ending so devastating. In 2003, Sandra Bullock's 10-year-old godson was a fan of the Discovery Channel show Monster Garage and wanted to meet its host, Jesse James. Bullock arranged the meeting as a Christmas present for the boy, taking him on a tour of West Coast Choppers, James's custom motorcycle garage. James built custom motorcycles that sold for as much as $300,000, and the shop had become a cultural landmark for fans of the show. Nobody walked into that garage expecting a love story. Bullock, by that point, was one of the most recognizable actresses in the world, known for her warmth, her comedic timing, her reputation as America's sweetheart. James was a tattooed, motorcycle-building reality TV personality with a rougher public image entirely. On paper, they made no sense together. But something clicked. They began dating, and the relationship moved with real intensity. James proposed with a vintage Tiffany diamond ring dating back to 1910, a ring with history, chosen specifically because it wasn't a flashy new purchase, but something that felt rooted in something real. Bullock said of the ring that someone else had worn it, that it made sense to them, and that it felt historic rather than simply expensive. On July 16, 2005, Bullock, then 40, and James, then 35, married in a private sunset ceremony at the 334-acre Folded Hills Ranch near Santa Barbara. Bullock wanted the day to have a vintage Western barbecue feel. Guests sat on haystacks covered in horse blankets. There were no bridesmaids and no groomsmen. Bullock and James stood at the altar with Bullock's sister and James's children from his previous marriages. The couple walked down the aisle to a recording of Bullock's late mother, an opera singer, singing the aria Casta Diva. It was a wedding built on intimacy and intention rather than spectacle. And for a while, the marriage that followed seemed to match that promise. So what was actually happening underneath that surface once real life began? What made this marriage different from a typical Hollywood union was the family Bullock walked into on day one. James had been married twice before, and he brought 3 children into the relationship, a daughter named Chandler and a son named Jesse Jr. from his first marriage to Carla, and a daughter named Sunny from his second marriage to former adult film actress Janine Lindemulder. Bullock didn't treat this as a complication to manage. She embraced it fully. During a 2007 press conference promoting her film Premonition, she said directly, "Here's the thing, I have children. I'm married into children. I love those children. My concern and my love for those kids as a co-parent is no less than if I had that child biologically." This wasn't just talk. In the fall of 2009, James was granted sole temporary guardianship of his 5-year-old daughter Sunny after her mother, Janine Lindemulder, was sent to federal prison. When Lindemulder was released 6 months later and sought the return of custody, James and Bullock fought together for full legal custody and won, with Lindemulder receiving only weekly daytime visitation rights. That custody battle is worth sitting with for a moment. Bullock, one of the highest-paid actresses in the world, spent months in court fighting to keep a young girl who wasn't biologically hers, a girl who'd become her daughter through marriage and years of daily presence. They won that fight together. It should have been a sign that the foundation underneath their marriage was solid. It wasn't. They just fought and won a custody battle together, proof, it seemed, that this family could survive anything. So why didn't it? In March 2010, Sandra Bullock won the Academy Award for Best Actress for her performance in The Blind Side, the role that would define a new chapter of her career. On stage, accepting the award, she thanked her husband directly. "To my husband, there is no surprise that my work got better when I met you because I never knew what it felt like for someone to have my back. It was a vulnerable, specific thing to say in front of millions of people, not a generic thank you, but a real acknowledgement that this man had changed something fundamental about how safe she felt in her own life. 10 days later, everything she'd said on that stage became almost unbearable to watch back. Tattoo artist Michelle Bombshell McGee went public with claims of an affair she'd had with James while Bullock was away filming The Blind Side, the very movie that had just won her the Oscar. The timing wasn't a small detail. It was the detail. While Bullock was working toward the most significant achievement of her career, the marriage she'd publicly credited for making that achievement possible was already being broken from the inside. 2 more women came forward shortly after with their own allegations of infidelity during the marriage, and the story exploded into one of the biggest tabloid scandals of the year. The contrast was almost cruel, a woman at the absolute peak of professional triumph, watching her personal life collapse in real time, in public, with no ability to control the narrative. James later confirmed the cheating directly, telling DailyMail.com in 2017, "Yeah, I did cheat on my wife, yeah. I stood up and took accountability for it and apologized." But the simplicity of that later admission doesn't capture what those 10 days in March 2010 actually felt like for Bullock, or for anyone watching. What separated this scandal from a typical celebrity infidelity story wasn't just that James cheated, it was how many people came forward, and how long some of it had reportedly been going on. According to reporting at the time, multiple women came forward, McGee first, followed by at least 2 others. One of them claimed a relationship that had stretched on for years, not a single lapse, but something that had apparently been happening across a significant portion of the marriage. James eventually addressed the scale of what he'd done publicly, and the language he used was unusually blunt. He said he had thrown away an amazing life and marriage by his own hands, and accepted that he had become the most hated man in the world. There was no attempt to soften it or frame it as something more complicated than it was. But in a later interview, James offered a different angle on what had driven his behavior. He said he never fully believed Bullock truly loved him, that he felt like, at any moment, that rug was going to be yanked out from under him. That's a revealing thing to admit. It suggests James may have been carrying a deep insecurity throughout the marriage, a sense that he didn't belong in Bullock's world, that the relationship was somehow temporary, that he was always bracing for it to end. Whether that insecurity caused the infidelity, or whether it was simply a story he told himself afterward, is something only he can answer. But it doesn't change what actually happened or what it cost. Bullock, for her part, has never publicly litigated the details of what James said about his motivations. She's spoken about the pain of the period in general terms, but she's never gone point by point through his justifications, which in itself says something about how she chose to move forward, not by arguing the narrative in public, but by simply removing herself from it. Plenty of marriages survive infidelity. It's not automatically a relationship-ending event for every couple. So it's worth asking directly, why couldn't this marriage survive it? The first answer is scale. This wasn't one affair, one mistake, one moment of weakness that could be isolated and processed. Multiple women came forward, which meant Bullock wasn't dealing with a single breach of trust. She was dealing with a pattern. Patterns are categorically harder to forgive than isolated incidents because they suggest something structural about the person's choices. The second answer is timing. The affair came to light just 10 days after Bullock won her first Oscar, and one of the affairs had reportedly occurred while she was away filming the very movie that earned her that award. That timing meant Bullock couldn't experience the highest professional moment of her life without it being permanently linked to the worst personal moment of her life. Those 2 things happened in the same 10-day window, and that proximity isn't something you can simply separate afterward. The third answer is what James himself admitted, that he didn't believe Bullock loved him, that he was waiting for the rug to be pulled out. If that's true, it suggests a fundamental mismatch in how secure each of them felt inside the relationship. Bullock had publicly described feeling, for the first time, like someone truly had her back. James was apparently walking around with the opposite feeling, convinced it could end at any moment. That kind of mismatch doesn't necessarily cause infidelity on its own, but it creates exactly the kind of internal instability that makes betrayal more likely. And finally, there's the matter of what was happening at home during all of this. The couple was in the midst of secretly adopting their son Louis when the affair allegations became public, which means this wasn't simply a betrayal between two adults. It intersected directly with the most vulnerable, hopeful, family-building moment of their relationship. Discovering that kind of infidelity while quietly working through an adoption adds a particular kind of devastation that's hard to overstate. Trust once broken at that scale, with that timing, against that emotional backdrop, isn't something most people can simply rebuild. Bullock filed for divorce in April 2010, just weeks after the scandal broke. She cited discord or conflict of personalities as the legal reason, the standard language used in countless celebrity divorces. The divorce was finalized that June, after James completed a stint in a rehabilitation facility. What's notable about how Bullock handled the public side of the divorce is what she didn't do. She didn't do a tell-all interview cycle. She didn't publicly tear James apart in the press, even though she would have had every justification. She paused her press obligations for The Blind Side at the time, citing unforeseen personal reasons, which was about as much explanation as she offered publicly. The one thing Bullock fought hardest to protect throughout the entire process was the family she'd built, particularly the children. The adoption of their son Louis, which had been happening secretly in the background of the scandal, went forward, and Bullock became his mother. Despite the very public collapse of her marriage to James, she continued raising Louis as her own son. This matters because it tells you something about what Bullock actually valued. The marriage to James didn't survive, but the commitment she'd made to motherhood was never in question. She separated the failure of the marriage from the parts of her life she'd built that were worth keeping. That's a difficult distinction to make in the middle of a public scandal, and she made it anyway. Looking at the full picture now, decades removed from the headlines, the reason this marriage couldn't survive isn't really a mystery. It's a combination of factors that, individually, might have been survivable, but together created something that simply couldn't hold. There was the scale of the infidelity, not one affair but several, with at least one reportedly stretching on for years. There was the timing, a betrayal that became public in the same narrow window as the highest professional achievement of Bullock's life, permanently linking the two in a way neither of them could undo. There was the emotional asymmetry James himself later admitted to, a deep insecurity that made him feel, throughout the marriage, like the relationship was temporary, like it could be taken away at any moment. And there was the fact that all of this intersected directly with the most hopeful, vulnerable parts of their shared life, the children they were raising and adopting together, the family they'd fought in court to protect and build. Sandra Bullock has never built a public narrative around blame or bitterness regarding this period. She's talked in general terms about the pain of it, but she's never used James's later admissions as ammunition. What she's done instead, in the years since, is build a life centered on the children she chose to keep raising, regardless of what happened to the marriage that brought some of them into her life in the first place. That, in the end, might be the most accurate way to understand why this particular marriage couldn't survive. It wasn't a lack of love at the start. It wasn't a lack of effort during the relationship. It was a betrayal severe enough, repeated enough, and badly timed enough that no amount of commitment on Bullock's side could repair what had already been broken from the other. Bullock walked away from the marriage, but she never walked away from the family she'd built inside it. And that distinction says a lot about who she actually is. If this video gave you a clearer picture of what really happened, hit the like button. It genuinely helps this channel grow. Subscribe if you want more deep dives into the real stories behind the headlines you thought you already knew. And drop a comment below. Were you following this story back when it broke in 2010? Let me know what you remember.